Tonight's lecture is the 9th annual Rohrbach Memorial Lecture. It honors William Rohrbach, who received his BA in 1985 from St. John's in Annapolis and his MA in Eastern Classics here in Santa Fe in 1998. These Rohrbach lectures are dedicated to topics pertaining to the Eastern Classics. We are grateful for the support of the William H. and Maddie Wattis Harris Foundation, which makes these lectures possible. This evening we have two representatives of the foundation with us. So please join us in thanking Elizabeth Rohrbach and Louisa Height for being here and helping to make this lecture possible. They're right here in the front row. And it's a pleasure and an honor to have Stephanie Jamison join us as tonight's speaker. She is the Distinguished Professor of Asian Languages and Cultures and Indo-European Studies at the University of California in Los Angeles. The quality of her scholarship has been recognized by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which elected her as a member in 2017. They identify her as the ranking scholar of the oldest text of the Vedic period, and note that her studies are models of keen thinking and methodological clarity. Now, all you students and most of you faculty here have had practice translating Greek. Some of you have even tried your hands at poetry. The translation that Professor Jamison is most celebrated for is the Rig Veda. Some 20 years ago, Patrick Olivelle, who has spoken here, asked Miss Jamison and Joel Brereton to do a quick little translation of it. This is the Rig Veda. It is the oldest work in Sanskrit. It includes over 1,000 poems by over 200 poets with complex structures and idiosyncratic uses of language. So based on your experience with Greek, I think you can imagine how quick this little translation would be. You might also imagine that she has good advice for students grappling with translation. And I'll pass along some words of wisdom that she shared while visiting the University of Texas. And I'll pass it along because it applies to Greek too. A fellow Sanskrit student was complaining a little about the abundant grammar of this highly inflected language. And Professor Jamison helpfully said, "Grammar is your friend." With that, please join me in welcoming Professor Jamison.
I don't think that I can cap Kathleen's lovely introduction, and I also am not going to talk at all about the Rig Veda today, so you may be aggrieved or pleased. There is a handout for this talk, and it's probably necessary, so if you don't have one, you might want to pick one up. Okay. Before I begin the lecture proper, I'd like to introduce myself slightly differently, who I am and what I do, and a bit of how I came to do it, since it's very different from the St. John's way, a way I'm actually quite familiar with, because my sister and brother-in-law taught for decades at St. John's in Annapolis, and in fact, my sister also taught some summers here in Santa Fe. So I have the jump on you. I know what you do, and you probably don't know what I do. You may not know at the end of the evening either. Okay, I'm afraid this preamble will not be brief. But I think it's necessary in order to follow what follows. I was trained as a linguist, specifically a historical linguist, and even more specifically an Indo-Europeanist. I now work primarily on Sanskrit, and particularly on the most ancient Sanskrit text, the Rig Veda, as Kathleen said. But for tonight's lecture, the linguist part of me and the Indo-European part of me are necessary preliminaries. Linguists are, roughly, concerned with the structure of language, both in general and in particular languages. Historical linguists are concerned with how languages change, both in general and for particular languages, and how these changes affect the structures of the language undergoing change. Historical linguists are also interested in the reverse of change, namely looking at a particular stage of a language and walking back the changes that got it there. Performing this reverse process yields some amazing results, as I'll show in a minute. But first, let's start with a single language at a single point in time and with two facts, which you'll find on the handout. Fact one is languages are varying and changing every time we open our mouths. Every time we open our mouths, things come out slightly differently, even when you think you're saying the same thing. And two, people talk more like the people they talk to than the people they don't. When you put those two facts together, here's what results. If there's a breakdown in communication between two groups of people, for whatever reason, geographical separation, social separation, generational separation, that's fact two. The way these two groups talk is slowly but surely going to drift apart, first into dialect differences, then into separate languages, because constant variation, that's fact one, produces changes in speech, which almost imperceptibly move in different directions in the different speech communities. This is how language differentiation comes about, how, for example, Latin became French, Spanish, Italian, and so on. A nearby example is one I just read about the other day in the New York Times, the so-called traditional Spanish, spoken around here and further north in New Mexico, which has been going its own way since the 16th century and constitutes a distinct and very interesting dialect of Spanish with some very archaic things preserved and some very new things in it as well. So that's an example that should come somewhat home to you. Reversing the process involves looking at French, Spanish, Italian, etc., and trying to work our way back to Latin. Look at my rather primitive diagram on the handout. It turns out that just starting with those languages, or whatever Romance languages we happen upon, enables us to work our way back very precisely to Latin, to restore the Latin ancestral to them, all in remarkable detail, even without access to Latin itself. This kind of restoration is known in linguistics as reconstruction, and it depends on a third fact about language, a non-intuitive fact about the way all languages change. The fact is going to sound pretty unglamorous, but it's the basis on which the whole edifice of historical linguistics is founded. The fact is, sound change is regular. I'm going to let the enormity of this fact sink in, okay? That is, if in a particular language, a particular sound X becomes Y, in every word that contains X, it will become Y. It won't stay X or decide to become Z. Meaning has no effect on this. It's purely a matter of sound, of phonology. What this means and why it's important is that if you look at two languages that descended from a common source, like Latin, but went in different directions, there will be regular patterns of sound correspondence between the languages. Let's now leave the Romance languages and move to Latin and English, or English and Latin, another of my rather shaky diagrams. English 2 corresponds to Latin duo. They both have the same meaning. 10 corresponds to decem. Tooth corresponds to dent. Note that the sounds are not the same in the two languages. It's the pattern that's the same. Every T, English T, is met with a Latin D. Whatever the original sound in question was, Every occurrence of it came out as T in English and as D in Latin. Needless to say, it's a little more complicated, but I'm leaving that aside. When you see such a pattern, you can first hypothesize that the two languages are related and came from a common source. And second, you can reconstruct a single sound from which the two sounds in the later two languages developed. We mark these reconstructed, aka made up sounds, with an asterisk. So here in the first instance, asterisk or star X. And then we try to give it some linguistic reality to say what we think the sound actually was. In this case, the standard reconstruction is asterisk D, which stayed D in Latin and changed to English in part of a shift that's known as Grimm's Law, which you may or may not have heard of. When you reconstruct a number of sounds based on the same types of patterns, you get reconstructed words. And with reconstructed words, you get a whole language. In the case we began with, of Spanish, French, and Italian, the language we construct on their basis turns out to look almost exactly like Latin, which is, of course, what we want. But in the case of Latin and English, the language we're reconstructing is one for which we have no direct evidence. Unlike the Spanish-French example, where we can use their evidence to reconstruct Latin, a language we already have, in the English-Latin case, we reconstruct a parent language that is not attested, a so-called proto-language, which we call Proto-Indo-European. It is the parent language of most of the attested languages, ancient and modern, from northern India and Central Asia to the western edge of Europe. You see another one of my diagrams there, including Sanskrit, the ancient classical language of India, numerous forms of Iranian, Greek, Latin and Romance, Celtic, Germanic, that's us, Slavic, and so on, a bunch more. Some long dead, some very much alive. It is linguistically the mother of us all as English speakers. Why this is relevant tonight and why I have taken you on this detour through phonology, not everybody's favorite subject, is that when you reconstruct a language, you perforce also reconstruct a culture. Reconstructed words have reconstructed meanings. Get enough of them and put them into structures, and they tell us not only what things our proto-people had, but also what they talked about, how they categorized their world, both material and immaterial. And this gives us a window into prehistory that is quite different from, and the linguist in me will say, more precious than, anything archaeologists can dig up out of the ground. One of the things cultures have always had, is stories. Myths, legends, tales, sagas, whatever. And one of the more outre aims of some Indo-Europeanists is to reconstruct not merely language and culture, which might seem quite a lot, but also the stories that the proto-speakers may have told each other in proto-time. It's a tricky procedure, and many more people have done it badly than have done it well, but the process is, in principle, no different from reconstructing sounds. You'd look at two attested examples of stories in two different but cognate languages and compare them to see if they are likely to have descended from a common source. Tonight, I'm going to do this with a small episode in the great Greek epic, the Iliad. As I just said, Greek is an Indo-European language. Consider Greek duo and deca and odont next to the words that I gave you for Latin and English. And compare it to something in the great Sanskrit epic, the Mahābhārata, to which text I'll give you a quick introduction now. Given St. John's curriculum, I know you're all tolerably familiar with the Iliad, but the Mahābhārata is quite possibly a different thing. The Mahābhārata is one of the two great Sanskrit epics, the other being the Ramayana, which we will briefly return to later. Unlike the Homeric epics, these are not the oldest texts in Sanskrit, far from it, but they contain much older material, especially the Mahābhārata. This text is vast, The standard Western-centered metric is that it's 8 times the length of the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. Okay, yes, I know this is a metric that will resonate for you, right? A lot of text. It's the story of a ruinous intrafamilial war between 2 sets of cousins. Our heroes, are the Pandavas, 5 brothers who all happen to be married to the same woman, Draupadi. Thereby hangs a tale, but I won't tell it now. The incident in question takes place when they have all been sent into the forest for a 12-year exile. Thereby hangs another tale, which I also will not relate. Okay, now that you have the basic relevant structure in mind, let us finally turn to the Iliad. We're now on the top of page 2 of the handout. The third book of the Iliad contains some of the best-known scenes in that epic. Scenes that have also long been the subject of intense debate in Homeric criticism. I refer particularly to the Teikhoskopia, the viewing from the wall, in which Helen identifies certain Greek heroes for the benefit of Priam and other Trojan elders, and the subsequent single combat between Menelaus and Paris, a duel that is supposed to settle the war. The victor is to get Helen and her possessions, and the Greeks will go home whatever happens. This tidy solution to a messy war is thwarted by Aphrodite, who spirits Paris away from the battlefield and returns him to an initially disgruntled Helen. To refresh your memories, let me briefly summarize the action a bit more. Book 3 of the Iliad begins with the Greek and Trojan armies marshaling for battle. But before battle commences, Paris, the abductor of Helen, suggests that the war be settled by single combat between him and Menelaus, Helen's former husband. As the arrangements are being made for their duel, the goddess Iris in disguise comes to Helen, who is weaving in her chamber, to tell her about this new development and summons her to watch it. She goes to the wall overlooking the battlefield, where Priam, her current father-in-law, is sitting with other Trojan elders. Looking out at the assembled Greek army, Priam asks Helen to identify certain key figures, and she does. The scene changes to the battlefield, where an elaborate oath-taking ritual is first performed. Then Menelaus and Paris begin to fight, but when things start going badly for Paris, the goddess Aphrodite plucks him up, takes him to his bedchamber, and brings an initially reluctant Helen back to him. Common sense Homeric criticism has identified certain features of these scenes as anomalous, particularly their temporal position. How, in the 10th year of a bloody war, fought within the sight of the walls of Troy, could Priam not recognize Greeks like Agamemnon? Why was the duel between Helen's aggrieved husband and her abductor postponed for 9 years and then casually set up as a winner-take-all finale to a war that by now would seem to have a life of its own? Why is Helen Priam's interlocutor, and what connection, if any, do the viewing and the duel have with each other? Common sense answers to these objections have a rather desperate and patched together air. That Priam did recognize the Greeks but asked Helen about them anyway, quote, to help her out in a delicate situation, it is an explanation that owes more to mismanners than to epic sensibilities. Similarly, the both sides agreed to the duel because they were worn out is belied by the many weary battles that lie ahead. Rather than attempting to account for the puzzling features of the episodes in such pragmatic but ad hoc ways, the expert Homeric consensus, seems instead to be that the anomalies result from the displacement of these scenes from another part of the poem, or indeed from a different poem. Quote, that the episode, i.e. the Teikhoskopia, in an altered form originally belonged to an earlier stage of the war and has been transposed to its present place for the purposes of the monumental Iliad. Estimates of these purposes vary, for example, to introduce us to Helen, present her character or emotions, praise the Greek heroes, or show Priam's characters. Opinions about the source of the narrative motif also vary. One scholar sees, quote, the princess on the wall as a common figure in the complex tradition of Oriental siege stories. Another suggests that the Teikhoskopia and the duel are the reworkings of a myth in which a woman looks on while two men contend for her, a myth ultimately deriving from a marriage contest. Still another believes that the Teikhoskopia has been assembled from a grab bag of independent motifs, the earlier part based on the display of prizes to competitors before a contest, the latter on a traditional viewing of the besiegers by defenders of a besieged city. He has perhaps most clearly expressed the commonly held opinion of the fragmentary nature of the sources of the part of this part of the epic. Quote, so the whole Teikhoskopia is composed of a number of set-piece ideas which occur separately and with a different purpose elsewhere. The common thread in these discussions seems to be that the episodes fill some function or about something other than what appears, and they consist of material originally different, even foreign in purpose, that has been jury-rigged and pressed into service. This apparent incompetence of this adaptation is ascribed by some to the oral nature of the epic, always a good whipping boy, or even to Homer's doting fondness for an earlier work of his own. I didn't make any of this up, by the way. In all these discussions of provenance and function, one important comparandum has been ignored, at least as far as I'm aware, and that's the evidence of the great heroic epic from a cognate tradition, the Indian Mahābhārata. Examined from the Indic point of view, the Teikhoskopia and the duel both appear to fulfill important structural roles in the larger narrative and to be crucially connected to each other. That it is Indic material that sheds this light suggests that this narrative complex may be an inherited one in both Greek and Sanskrit epic, and that it has a place in an Indo-European typology of marriage, both legal and illegal. So now let's go to India. As is well known to Indologists, the Sanskrit law codes regularly classify marriage into 8 categories, according to the circumstances under which the bridegroom takes charge of the bride. These categories are hierarchically ranked by position on the list, and the legality or not of any particular marriage type depend on its position and on the social class of the participants. The 7th of the 8 types is the Rakshasa or demonic marriage. It's the lowest type of legal union. This is marriage by capture or abduction, defined with unblinking violence in the law code of Manu, as you have it on handout 2, the abduction by force of a maiden weeping and wailing from her house after smashing and cleaving and breaking up her relatives and household, that is called the demonic. The texts usually agree, sometimes reluctantly, in considering this type of marriage legal for kshatriyas, i.e. members of the warrior class, along with the more peaceable Gandharva-type marriage by mutual agreement. This type of marriage not only has a secure position in the legal tradition, it is also regularly exemplified in the narrative literature. The Mahābhārata contains several discursive narratives of Rakshasa abductions, the most famous of which are Bhishma's abduction of Amba and her sisters, and Arjuna's of Krishna's sister Subhadra. Let us briefly examine some features of orthodox Rakshasa marriages that will be relevant in what follows. Though the legal description of Rakshasa marriage just quoted seems to depict a scene of chaotic violence, close examination of Rakshasa narratives shows that though the event was undeniably violent, it was only superficially chaotic. In fact, Rakshasa abduction mimics almost slavishly the orderly progression of an ordinary marriage ceremony. The correctly performed Rakshasa abduction is a ritual, a ceremony, and the important steps in a tranquil wedding, as set forth in the Gurhya Sutras, the text of the domestic ritual, all have their breathless and violent analogs in the abduction narrative. The crucial steps are the following. In an ordinary marriage, the would-be bridegroom sends a few wooers to the house of the girl. They ceremonially take a position and announce several times the name and lineage of the bridegroom and his intentions to the assembled household. In a Rakshasa abduction, Rakshasa marriage, the would-be abductor comes on a single chariot, sometimes with a second, a sort of substitute best man, but no additional companions, to the place where the maiden is, and announces his name and lineage and his intention to abduct. As in the vivid proclamation of Bhishma in the Mahābhārata that I give you at the bottom of page 2, I proclaim to all the kings assembled there, Bhishma Shamtanava takes these maidens. His name, his lineage, Shamtanava is the patronymic, and his intention to abduct. And then he does. The analog to the assembled household that hears this announcement under ordinary circumstances is an armed host, as in the case of Bhishma and Amba, an assemblage of kings attending the scheduled bridal self-choice, Svayambara, of the girl who gets snatched. The abductor's announcement is accompanied by a challenge. He will fight them all. In fact, he must fight them, an act of heroism, virya, that substitutes for the bride price, the shulka, in some other marriage types. Now, the point of all this is that Rakshasa abduction has certain legal requirements. It must be first announced, second witnessed, and third fought for. So in the little handy chart I gave you, in the normal ceremony, wooers come to bride's family, announce name and lineage of bridegroom, and his intention to ask to marry the maiden. In the Rakshasa equivalent, the abductor comes on a single chariot and announces his name and lineage and his intention to abduct the maiden. The bride's male relatives witness the announcement in the regular marriage ceremony. Assemblage of kings or armed host witness the announcement in the Rakshasa abduction. And then in the third normal ceremony, the bridegroom provides a bride price, often in the form of a deed of valor, virya shulka. In the Rakshasa abduction, the abductor challenges and fights the assembled host. But if these requirements are met, the abduction itself is legal. It is a recognized marriage, and there is nothing that an annoyed family or disappointed former suitor or husband can do about it. Let us now remember who the successful bridegroom in these marriages is. As I noted above, the texts allow the marriage type only for kshatriyas, members of the warrior class, and in fact, Bhishma at one point in the Mahābhārata rather startlingly proclaims it as the best type of marriage for warriors. Indeed, one scholar has discussed, abduction does fit kshatriya dharma, warrior custom, better than other types in several important ways. It requires an act of heroism appropriate to a warrior behavior, and perhaps more important, it involves taking the girl by force, not accepting her. Most marriage types explicitly involve the gift of the girl by her father, and it is contrary to the warrior's code to accept gifts. Now, all this sets up an interesting counter situation, which we're going to discuss on page 3. If a correctly performed abduction is legal, then an incorrectly performed one, skimping on the ceremonial steps or on the heroic activity accompanying them, is illegal, and illegal in interesting and non-trivial ways. The existence, at least in theory, of legal abduction defines and sharpens the outrage of the illegal type. It is not merely lawless in general, but it may involve the perpetrator not only in breaking society's rules regarding marriage, but in transgressing in specific ways the code of his class. This double illegality may account for its power as a narrative theme. Two great Indo-European epics, the Greek Iliad and the Indian Ramayana, are essentially stories about the repercussions of an illegal abduction. For those of you who don't know the Ramayana, I'll give you the capsule, the fingernail version of this. The Ramayana focuses on the illegal abduction of Sita, the wife of the prince Rama, by a 10-headed monster named Ravana, and the following large and long and very bloody campaign mounted by Rama to recover her, to re-abduct her in some sense. So that's the Ramayana in 30 seconds. And what are the repercussions? We saw above that the family of a girl correctly abducted has no recourse. The marriage must be accepted. But an illegal abduction is quite different. There is a legal remedy, which I will call the reabduction or the counter-abduction. The injured party or parties can assemble a posse and pursue the abductor with intent to fight and recapture the woman. Thus, Rama can follow Ravana and Sita to Lanka, and Menelaus can follow Paris and Helen to Troy. By now, it should be no surprise that the counter-abduction has its own rules and ceremonial steps, nor should it be too surprising that many of these steps are mirror image analogs of the expected steps in a correct abduction, especially those steps that were left out or incorrectly performed in the illegal abduction. Before we return to Greece, which I promise we will, let us define the parameters of the counter-abduction in India, not in the sprawling extravagance of the Ramayana, but in a confined and consequently pointed narrative in the Mahābhārata, the abduction and reabduction of Draupadi. This is all in handout Roman 5. As we established earlier, Draupadi is the wife simultaneously of the 5 Pandava brothers, the main heroes of the Mahābhārata. Her abduction occurs in, coincidentally, also the 3rd book, the Aranyaka Parvan, or forest book, during which the Pandavas spend a tedious 12-year mandated exile in the wilderness. Our episode begins when the Pandavas go off hunting, which they do all the time, leaving Draupadi virtually alone with only a maidservant and a house priest as companions. By gender and by profession, those two don't really count. A king called Jayadratha happens by, accompanied by a great retinue, and is quite taken by the beautiful Draupadi. Coming to her hermitage with a group of companions, he first introduces himself properly, but shortly thereafter urges her to mount his chariot and become his wife. When she refuses, he violently forces her onto it and takes off. The priest raises an objection to this behavior. It's a telling one for our purposes. Rather than saying, as we would probably wish him to do, you cannot abduct this virtuous wife or stop this outrageous violence against an innocent woman. He says instead, as you have on the handout, this woman cannot be led or married, these are the same thing, by you without your having conquered great chariot fighters. Look to the ancient dharma or custom of the warrior, O Jayadratha. So he does not condemn or forbid the abduction per se, but rather states that it would be legal if Jayadratha engaged in combat. Jayadratha's abduction is in fact illegal on every count that we have identified. He has not announced his intention, his actions have no legal witnesses, and he performs no feats of valor. Draupadi had already warned Jayadratha that one of her husbands, Arjuna, and his comrade and brother-in-law, Krishna, will pursue him on a single chariot, the vehicle that a proper abductor would choose. And indeed, when the brothers returned from hunting and learned what happened, they all set out in pursuit in a frenzy that is measurably increased when they see Draupadi standing on Jayadratha's chariot. This scene is so far unremarkable. Of course they would pursue her. Of course they would be frenzied. And equally, of course, Jayadratha would attempt to escape and carry off his prize. But what follows is not predictable in a universal script. As the Pandavas close in on the abductor's chariot, all action seems to cease, freeze-framed, as it were, for 19 temporally suspended verses. Trishtube verses at that, each with 4 11-syllable lines. Do the math here. A remarkably lengthy interruption to this dramatic chase scene. It is worth noting that these verses are so-called irregular trishtubes, and as such most likely belong to the oldest Kshatriya core of our surviving Mahābhārata. This is not recently introduced epic filler, of which we have so much in the Mahābhārata, but it belongs to the heart of the text. And what happens in these verses? When Jayadratha espies the Pandavas bearing down, he turns to Draupadi, standing next to him on the chariot, which presumably is still careering madly along on the not straight and smooth roads of ancient India. And he says, "These 5 great chariot warriors are coming hither, and I think they are your husbands." Oh, Krishna, this is an epithet of Draupadi. "Recognizing them, O fair-haired one, proclaim to us in sequence each one of the Pandavas standing on the chariot." At this request, Draupadi first crows over him, then agrees to perform this identification. The phrasing of her acquiescence is critical, but all this must be pronounced to one about to die, proclaimed by me to you, since I was asked. That is the law. Draupadi's identification of her husband is a legal requirement in this situation. Jayadratha was not simply making idle chatter in his request, and he surely must have a good idea who the mad pursuers were that were right behind him. So why, in this panic and pressure-filled moment, must they take the time for a set of leisurely introductions? The answer comes from the ceremonies we have already discussed. Recall that the very first step in both the ordinary marriage and the legal abduction is the wooing, the formal announcement by the bridegroom or his proxies of his name and lineage to the bride's family or protectors, a step left out of the illegal abductions. What we have here in the scene is what I call a mirror image wooing, whose configuration is appropriate to the counter-abduction. The woman ceremonially identifies by name and qualities the reabductors, who can then legitimately claim her back as their wife because she has done the wooing for them, as it were. She does so to the person who illegally has her in his power and who thus fulfills in a fractured way the role of her guardian and protector. And she certainly takes the ceremonial aspects of her task very seriously. She doesn't just point at 5 men in rapid succession and say, "Watch out for that one." Instead, each husband receives at least 2 verses, usually 3, and each is introduced by an archaic syntactic cum literary device, 1 or more descriptive, even definitional relative clauses, followed by a minimal main clause that reveals his personal name. This stylistic device is familiar from the earliest Sanskrit, especially memorably in Rigveda 2:12, a hymn with 12 succeeding verses, each beginning with a sequence of relative clauses, and each ending with a snappy main clause, Sajjanasa Indra. That, folks, is Indra. We can sample Draupadi's version in her first identification, which starts at the very bottom of page 3 and continues on to page 4, that of Yudhishthira, the chief Pandava, noticing that his lineage is neatly included with his name in the end. So, at the top of whose standard sound the 2 drums, the sweet Nanda and Upananda suitably formed, him who knows the decisions concerning his own law and purpose do the busy people always follow, who is pure and bright as gold, large-nosed, slender, long-eyed, him they call the best of the Kurus, Yudhishthira, son of Dharma, my husband. And so she continues in similar vein through the rest of her husbands, ending with a formal summary, thus have these sons of Pandu been declared. And then all hell breaks loose. The 5 Pandavas alone attack and defeat in spectacularly bloody fashion the great army accompanying Jayadratha, hundreds of warriors, elephants, horses, and so on. Again, this has its analog in legal abduction. the Pandavas, the reabductors, perform the act of valor that serves as bride price in a Rakshasa marriage, and that was omitted by Jayadratha. At this battle, Jayadratha, the original abductor, again displays his craven unworthiness. Rather than fight, he dismounts and attempts to flee. When he is overtaken, the Pandavas do not even kill him, despite Draupadi's urgings. He does not deserve to die in battle as a proper warrior would, but instead he is forced to agree to proclaim himself a slave of the Pandavas, whereupon he is released. So they say to him, "You must proclaim in sessions and assemblies, 'I am a slave. Just thus would I give life to you. That is the rule imposed by me who won the fight.'" Note the contemptuous dadyam, "I would give." The failed warrior Jayadratha must humble himself to accept a gift, his own life. The sparing of Jayadratha's life is hardly an act of compassion and forgiveness, but a calculated humiliation of a man who has not only offended against Draupadi and her husbands, but has violated the code of his warrior class. Thus, the incident is closed. The counter-abduction has been accomplished with the appropriate ceremonial wooing and act of valor lacking in the original abduction. Draupadi is reunited with her husbands, and the abductor is suitably punished. Let me briefly summarize this in the little Roman 6. In the illegal abduction, the abductor anonymously snatches the girl. In a legal reabduction, the abducted maiden announces the names and lineages of the reabductors. In the illegal abduction, there are no witnesses or no witnesses who count to the abduction. In the legal reabduction, the announcement is witnessed by the abductor or his kin. In the illegal abduction, no act of valor. In the legal reabduction, the reabductors fight the abductor. With this Indic paradigm in mind, we may now return to Greece. And by now, it should probably be fairly clear what I want to say about the episodes, in the Homeric episode. If the Iliad is, in one sense, begins as a vast reabduction narrative, this may not be what Homers thinks, but that's what I think. Book 3 concentrates the primary ceremonial steps of a counter-abduction, a reabduction. The Teikhoskopia and the duel are tightly linked parts of a single narrative complex. Neither is an orphaned story fragment jammed randomly into empty epic space. Iliad is the first point in the epic where we see the Greeks and Trojans together. It is supposedly the 10th year of the war is fairly unimportant from a narrative point of view. It is entirely appropriate that the correct steps in a counter-abduction should be laid out at this first Greek-Trojan encounter, and this is exactly what happens. Iliad 3 is parallel point by point to the counter-abduction of Draupadi, but with a surprise ending. The Teikhoskopia corresponds to the counter-wooing. The great oath sworn corresponds to the witnessing required in both ordinary marriages and marriages by abduction, and the duel of Menelaus and Paris to the Pandavas' combat with the army of Jayadratha. The outcome for Paris is similar to the fate of Jayadratha, but has vastly different effects on the story. Let me take up these points each in turn, beginning with the Teikhoskopia. Helen's tranquil, almost elegiac musings on the wall certainly differ in mood from Draupadi's defiant speech on a lurching chariot. But the two episodes serve the same purpose, the counter-wooing, the identification and announcement of the pursuers intending to reabduct the woman. The only difference is that Draupadi speaks directly to her original abductor, while Priam serves as surrogate or proxy for his son Paris. Remember that proxies can be used in the original wooing too. The seeming interruption of the action that commentators have noticed, indeed sometimes complained of, the arbitrary suspension of time between Paris's challenge to Menelaus and the actual duel that has made some consider the Teikhoskopia an awkwardly handled intrusion in the text, is the same effect produced by Draupadi's freeze-framed monologue on the chariot. And I think the same pointed artfulness is at work in both epics. Violent and decisive action has been set in motion, is both inevitable and imminent, and then the motion stops at its most dramatic, while the measured, tradition-bound voice of legality and ceremony confers legitimacy on the violence to come. The duel cannot proceed until Helen has spoken. She is not a casual onlooker, but the key to the whole. Interpreting the Teikhoskopia as a counter-wooing not only helps account for the existence of this episode and its narrative placement, but also explains some misunderstood details. Previous discussions of the scene, which treat it as a truncated catalog of heroes, following closely on the catalog of ships, have sometimes expressed puzzlement over the choice of heroes identified, since some more distinguished fighters, e.g. Diomedes, are left out. But Priam invites Helen not to identify heroes, but rather her former relatives. This is in 7.1. Sit with me, he says, so that you may see your previous husband and your kinsman by marriage and your dear ones. In a counter-wooing, the people to be named would be those likely to form a part of the original posse to recover the stolen woman. That is, her kinsman and her husband and his kinsmen and supporters. And such are the people Helen identifies. Now, interestingly enough, Menelaus is not formally part of the question and answer sequence. His presence lurks there. He is referred to in the passage just quoted, your previous husband, and mentioned by name in a number of lines. His brother Agamemnon is the first on the list, followed by Odysseus, who with Menelaus had attempted to recover Helen before. Aias is mentioned briefly, but followed by Idomeneus, who had been a frequent guest of Helen and Menelaus. Thus far, then, her husband by implication, his kinsmen, and several close supporters. In the last part of the catalog, Helen turns to her own kinsmen, remarking on the absence of her twin brothers, Castor and Polydeuces. It is perhaps worth noting that the last two people Draupadi identifies in her counter-wooing are the twins Nakula and Sahadeva, though it is probably wiser not to make too much of this. Like Draupadi, Helen emphasizes in her response to Priam that she has been asked for this information. I will tell this to you, which you ask and inquire of me. We're now at the top of page 5. The style of her response is also similar to Draupadi's, an anonymous but elaborate description followed starkly by the name. But instead of distributing these functions between relative clauses relative clause and main clause of a single speaker, they are split into a question and answer dialogue between Priam and Helen. Priam describes and Helen names. Indeed, Priam's description has usually been maneuvered into a relative clause, despite its interrogative function, as though the relative clause main clause structure had to be maintained at all costs. Consider Priam's first question, so you should name that huge man, whoever is that Achaean man, noble and great. Helen's reply is always shaped in the same way, conforming to the Sajjanasa Indra style of Draupadi's response. For example, in line 178, that one is the son of Atreus, wide-ruling Agamemnon. The counter-wooing of the Teikhoskopia is followed almost immediately by the duel of Paris and Menelaus, just as Draupadi's speech immediately precedes the Pandavas' attack. But interposed in the Iliad is an elaborate oath-taking ceremony, the most fully described such ritual in the text, which brings Priam himself down from the wall to the Trojan plain. The purpose of the ceremony is to affirm before the gods and the mortals of both sides the terms of the duel as suggested by Paris. So, put me, Paris, that is Paris, and warlike Menelaus in the middle to fight about Helen and all her possessions. Whichever shall win and turn out to be the stronger, let him take all the possessions and lead the woman home. The oath-taking occupies nearly 80 lines and represents almost as long a break in the action as the Teikhoskopia. In its climactic moment, Agamemnon calls upon the gods and powers, especially Zeus and Helios, in the famous, well, it's famous to people like me, archaic inherited syntagm, zoi pater e elioste, O Father Zeus in the vocative, and e elios in the nominative, to witness and guard the oaths. You be witnesses, guard these sworn oaths. Why is this lengthy ritual here? It seems to reflect in part the crucial importance of witnessing in the marriage and legal abduction as discussed before. One of the distinctions between legal and illegal abductions is, of course, the presence or absence of witnesses to the act, witnesses who have the power and authority to intervene. Paris presumably made off with Helen in the first place without such witnesses. But now the denouement of the counter-abduction will take place under the proper circumstances. The act of heroism is about to take place. The duel that will serve as Paris's postponed bride price, his virya shulka, and after the fact, make his abduction legal or will conversely legitimize Menelaus's reabduction. And we all know what happens. Menelaus, not surprisingly, is gaining the upper hand over Paris when Aphrodite intervenes, swathing him in mist and transporting him from battlefield to bedchamber, where Helen is persuaded to repair, and the two tumble into bed. In one way, this is an ending very different from the Draupadi episode, in which the abductor was vanquished and the woman successfully reabducted. There, everyone ultimately played by the rules, and the story ended. In the Iliad, the dea ex machina intervenes, the rules are circumvented, and we luckily get the rest of the Iliad, which otherwise logically would have ended with Book 3. But in another way, this outcome is similar to that of Draupadi's abduction, or at least driven by the same principles. The duel between Paris and Menelaus could not have been allowed to proceed to a definitive conclusion. Not, as others have argued, because it is a displaced episode from a different epic entirely. Rather, it cannot go any further because Paris cannot be allowed either to win or to lose on the battlefield. His illegal abduction has offended against warrior conduct, and from that point of view, he is too contemptible to deserve a warrior's death. Like Jayadratha, he is humiliated instead, though the circumstances of his humiliation are luxurious and pleasurable. Just to compare the two reabductions, Draupadi's and Helen's, in Draupadi's, Draupadi announces the names and lineages of her husbands, the reabductor posse. Helen announces the names and lineages of the reabductor posse among the Greeks. It is witnessed by the abductor, Jayadratha, in Draupadi's reabduction. It's witnessed by the abductor's kin, Priam, and the Trojan elders, and later on by the gods. The reabductors fight the reabductor, humiliate him, and reclaim their wife in Draupadi's reabduction. In Helen's, the reabductor, her former husband, Menelaus, and abductor and Paris begin to fight. The fight is suspended. The wife is not reclaimed. So the reabduction is unsuccessful, and the Iliad can continue. But the lesson is the same as in the Draupadi episode. Both, I would suggest, belong to an inherited Indo-European narrative pattern that has its roots in a particular societal institution, the fine line between legal and illegal abduction in the typology of Indo-European marriage. Thank you.